This is Module 2, Section 4. We will be doing an in-depth review of the motor system. So this lesson we talk about the cortical motor system and action planning, and then we will be talking about motor units for the rest of the section. This section is meant to be a primer for the EMG module so that you guys can understand the biological basis of movement, as EMG recordings are from movement. We know that sensation is achieved through complex communication throughout the brain and body. And our questions for today are: how do signals cause movement? What are the components of the motor system? And what happens in the nervous system when we move? So the motor cortex is located near the top of the neocortex. It's loosely organized by body part with different regions of the cortex responsible for different movements. Much like the somatosensory cortex, there are larger regions of the motor cortex dedicated to body parts that require more complex processing. For example, the muscles of the face and the fingers have large dedicated areas on the motor cortex. The motor cortex can also be divided into premotor cortex and primary motor cortex areas. And there are two concepts that are often discussed in conjunction with these two areas, and that is kinematics and kinetics. Kinematics in motion has to do with the speed, direction, or magnitude of a movement. So this is a description of the movement. Kinetics in motion is about which muscles are called upon and activated in a movement. So this is how a movement is achieved. The premotor cortex is more contextual in action, meaning it responds to particular environments and thus has more to do with kinematics. The primary motor cortex controls kinetics. It's also important to note that the control of the motor cortex occurs contralaterally, just like many other things with the brain. So we'll look at the motor system as a whole. Of course, we have the motor cortex in the brain, which sends signals through the spinal cord to the muscles. And then, of course, the muscles are made up of muscle fibers and motor units. And the motor system is deeply intertwined with other systems that we've studied. So both the tactile and the visual system provide information about the environment for action planning and execution. Tactile sensation, mostly through mechanoreceptors in the skin, provide information about the progress of an action. And the visual system, of course, provides complex details on the body's position in space. Both of these contribute to feedback, feed-forward, and teaching mechanisms in the motor cortex that allow us to execute movements successfully. So, step-by-step action planning. Here we are. There are three major stages we can kind of think of. The first is taking in and interpreting the environment around you, which involves processes from other systems that we talked about. The second is called an action decision, which is thought to occur in the premotor cortex. Then that action decision is sent to the primary motor cortex. Once reaching the primary motor cortex, there are a series of transformations of the commands that are all conveyed to the spinal cord and eventually the muscles. So basically we are in an environment and we think of a movement, and that thought is coming kind of from the premotor cortex, right? We're interpreting the environment and making a decision. And then that decision is conveyed to the primary motor cortex, which causes the movement. So inaccuracies in motor control occur because of noise. I mean, do you ever wonder why after hours and hours and hours of training, athletes will still miss catches or free throws or, what have you? And it's because even in the most highly trained motor systems, there are natural fluctuations in the membrane potentials of the neurons in the premotor and the primary motor cortices that cause small errors in movement. These inaccuracies are constantly being monitored by the feedback and feed-forward mechanisms, as we discussed before. And the membrane fluctuations are referred to as noise. As a movement increases in precision or speed, the amount of noise increases as well. So just an overview of all the things we talked about. A signal is received, which triggers the premotor cortex to make an action decision, which is then conveyed to the primary cortex and thus to the spinal cord. Then that movement is monitored through feedback and feed-forward mechanisms. So, summary. The motor cortex is responsible for processing the signals associated with movement. The motor system as a whole extends from the brain all around the body and takes in information from other systems to perform feedback processing. Action planning can be mapped out in a series of steps from ideation in the frontal lobe to action planning in the motor cortex and action execution in the muscles. Motor signals are sometimes inaccurate due to large amounts of noise in the motor system in general. And as promised, in the next lesson, we will be talking about motor units.